following is a podcast episode brought to you by your friends at WSCA 106.1 FM, Portsmouth Community Radio. For more information on how you can become a member, please visit us at www.wscafm.org/support.
Episode 9. I cannot believe we are one episode away from double digits. How cool is that? This week we're joined by Mark Lefebvre, who happens to be the former roommate of our dad, Big Tim, in college years. So a really small world. We're learning that more and more every day. I love those stories, and we're so thankful to be connected to Mark. For those who have heard me talk about WSCAFM.org, our great partners up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Mark is a radio DJ and has his own great story of addiction, alcoholism, and recovery, that it is very important to him to keep the message moving, just like Faded. When Faded became a real thing and we wanted to get it off the ground, he heard it and reached out and wanted to do anything he could to be a part of that. And in conjunction with that, he's started his own project that's very similar in the form of a podcast. So he's been so wonderful, and the team up there has been so gracious to allow the Faded podcast to be streaming on a larger podcast series that they're putting out into the world as well. It includes the Faded podcast as an intro series, and then goes into Mark's series, Thanks for Asking, which is highlighting family and loved ones' stories of addiction and recovery. Unfortunately, in this world, there's not a ton of resources that are simple and right out there for family members and loved ones. There's a lot for addicts and alcoholics, and we as loved ones can really piggyback off of those quite a bit. But what we're aiming to do between these two podcast projects is to bring as much awareness as possible. So we're super pumped to have Mark with us this week, specifically even more excited to have him tell his own story of addiction and recovery, which is both heartbreaking and also very inspiring. He mentioned that he hadn't told his story publicly before, so this is really exciting, and we're so glad you're tuning in. His story goes through his childhood. He gives us a lot of insight into what he went through. He sheds a lot of light into childhood trauma, which is something we haven't talked about that much yet, but certainly very important into our continued education for all of you listeners and for our own selves in how we understand and get to know this disease even better. Childhood trauma is definitely one of many things that a lot of people struggle with, not only just in addiction, but in other stories. And a big part of, the treatment of addiction and alcoholism sometimes has to do with dual diagnosis. And believe it or not, those that struggle with alcoholism and addiction, a lot of people also struggle with other things in addition to that. And so it's not just about treating your alcoholism or treating your drug problem. It's also about getting down to the bottom of what is going on with you inside, internally, with your mental health, and really making sure that you're rounding out your recovery and your treatment by understanding every bit of yourself. So Mark's story is a great insight into that topic, and he does a great job of giving us kind of a detailed account of what he's been through. He takes us through his college years, the time with my dad, and then into his years as a top executive at IBM. A very kind of on the surface normal story from what we would think, but there is a lot of darkness and a lot of faded underneath when he gets into it. So Mark, thank you for joining us. We are so thrilled to have you behind the scenes with us and continuing this message. Your work is incredible. What you're doing is changing lives. Thank you for your dedication to not only your own recovery, but to so many others. And we look so forward to continuing this with you. So everybody, thank you for tuning in. As always, enjoy and welcome to episode 9. Welcome, Faded Fam. We have a very special guest today, somebody that's been actually behind the scenes with us for a couple months now that I'm really excited about. Mark Lefebvre up in New Hampshire, and a pretty
Seacoast of New Hampshire.
There you go, Seacoast. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
It's been so wonderful and helping to get our Faded story off the ground. We'll get to that a little later, but you yourself are recovered. And, to start this off, I would just love to know more about you and your story. I know that you're excited to tell it. So tell us a bit about you and who you are, where you came from, and what your story is all about.
Sure. So thanks, Jackie, for inviting me to participate. And I have to tell you that the popularity of the Faded series up here in New Hampshire is tremendous. We've had over 150 downloads of the first 8 episodes. And we've got a number of people following it through WSCA up here in Portsmouth. So thanks for allowing us to participate and partner with you and your family on this.
Thank you.
So who's Mark?
Who is Mark?
First of all, yes. I'm trying to figure out how far back you want to go. We're going to go back. We're going to turn
back.
the back machine. But basically, I grew up in central Massachusetts in a blue collar, I'd say middle class to lower middle class family. My dad was a firefighter and had a number of different jobs that he moonlighted with to make ends meet. My mom was at home at the time when I was growing up, but she worked in a bank both before and after I came into the picture. But I'm the oldest of 4 boys. There are only 6 years between the 4 of us. And
wow.
Yeah, so I grew up in a family where, alcohol and later on drugs in the form of weed were very, very prevalent. I grew up in an environment where the neighbors would get together with each other on somebody's stoop, their front porch, in the course of the nice weather and so forth, and indoors during the inclement weather. And they just got together and socialized, and beer was always part of that picture. Yep. And for as long as I can remember. But I grew up, initially we lived in the projects, and we lived upstairs from my Italian grandmother, which was kind of a hoot. And those are the fondest memories as a kid. And then we moved into our own home, and then I went off to college and so forth. So that's kind of a demographic setting. Again, I was the oldest of 4 boys, and 2 of my brothers are surviving. I lost my 3rd brother when he was 18, back when I was in college, ironically. Yeah. When I was 21 years old. And we can talk a little bit about that, because that childhood trauma and that experience was certainly part of what I was trying to escape from. Yeah. As I surrounded myself with self-medicating
absolutely
behaviors and so forth. So anyway, that's kind of sort of the lay of the land there.
Awesome. And where you said, where was your family home growing up?
Oh, Leominster, Massachusetts, which is about maybe 10 miles north of Worcester, where your dad and I went to school.
Awesome. I love it. I miss New England. I don't miss the weather, but I miss New England, and I love going up to visit. That's great. And you're now in New Hampshire.
Yes, my wife and I and my family. My wife and I moved up here in 1985, so we've been here 35 years. I've managed to lose much of my accent, but not all of it. I catch myself every now and then. And the only reason I know that I still don't have that accent is when I hear my brothers talk. It's brutal, and it's even more brutal when I hear my wife's family talk.
Oh my gosh. It brings me back home. It makes me happy. I love the accent. So
right. So yeah, we've been up here in the Seacoast since 1985.
So tell me a little bit about your early experiences, maybe with drugs and alcohol, or kind of, what's your earliest memory of something that might have been a little different, or that might have been a first experience or similar for your story?
Oh, that's a great question, because I often say when I do share my story, some people drink to kind of feel comfortable in their own skin, to build confidence, to lose their inhibitions, to escape emotional pain. Mm-hmm. When I started drinking, which was primarily at the age of 14, although every once in a while I'd steal a beer out of the cooler when we had a family gathering or something like that, but nothing that was really out of control. I drank for the effect. I liked the way it felt. I liked the way it made me feel. And later on, I kind of figured out that, that was kind of a way to self-medicate. I was feeling good about having a buzz on in order to take my mind off of whatever it was that was either troubling me or causing emotional pain. So, the first time I ever really got drunk, I was 14 years old. I did a sleepover out in the woods with some friends. One of their older brothers bought a case, and there were three of us, and we finished the case off, and, that was that. And, like I said, from that point forward, it was mostly, how do we get together on weekends and sneak beer or alcohol out of our parents' cupboards or refrigerators, or get an older sibling. I was the oldest, so when I was a kid, the drinking age was only 18.
Yeah.
And I was able to go into a liquor store, or a package store, or a packy, as we used to call them in Massachusetts. I used to be able to go in at the age of 16, and I'd never get carded.
Yeah.
And I had my first experience in a nightclub when I was 16. And, I never thought of myself as being a problem drinker until, I guess the first signpost for me was babysitting a neighbor's kids. It was just literally next door. And I broke into their liquor cabinet, and they had a bottle of Canadian Club, which is absolutely horrible. I hate Canadian whiskey. And I drank what I thought was probably about 8 or 9 shots in a very short amount of time. I blacked out. They woke me up when they got home. I was completely disoriented. They probably knew by my condition that I was really out of it. And I was so drunk that I could barely make it home. And the back screen door to my parents' house, the inside door wasn't locked. Yeah. And I couldn't open the screen door, and I'm pounding on the door. And my brother, who's a year younger than me, came over and opened the door, and he's saying, what's going on with you? I couldn't open the screen door, which was not locked, and passed out on the floor. Woke up the next morning, and my father said that, how'd you like that experience? And to be honest, I couldn't wait to do it again.
Yeah.
Couldn't wait to do it again.
Seems like a theme. I mean, do you remember, so back to that original case of beer when you were 14, do you remember like that feeling back then, or was it a little bit? Yeah.
I didn't, it was very rare until I got older that I was a blackout drinker. And I only did that on a handful of occasions. I also smoked weed for the first time that same summer. And it took a few times for me to really get the effect of it. And it's so much stronger now with their ability to, find different strains and so forth, and grow it and cultivate it and so forth. So, so it wasn't long before I was actually dabbling in harder drugs, but probably not until I was 17 or 18 years old.
Okay. And that seems like a fairly normal progression for most, right? It's you kind of go alcohol into weed. And then what did you get into next? And kind of what was your environment like around there? Like where were you getting it? Was it a group of friends, or was it just around? Like how did that,
I was a very high achieving partier. I went to school in a class size of about 500, and my class rank was about 20.
Wow.
And, I was an AP student, calculus, second year physics, chemistry. And all that stuff really came easy to me, really easy. I played football until my junior year, and I played baseball, varsity baseball. Back when I was in school, junior high school was 7, 8, and 9, and high school was 10, 11, and 12. We didn't make the transition to freshman in high school until after I graduated. So junior high school was a separate school altogether. So, but when I was 14 and 15, I was still in junior high school, wasn't driving, took a bus. So, and the only reason I mention that is that, I would smoke weed most days at the bus stop before going to school. And I was still able to, ace I was a straight A student in high school.
Wow.
And I also, like I said, I played varsity baseball. And I was an outfielder. I never mixed drugs and playing baseball, because probably one of the hardest things to do is to hit a baseball, sober and straight, let alone, after smoking or drinking.
Right.
And I really, really loved baseball, so I wasn't going to put it at any risk. But towards my 16, 17 birthday, the drugs that were readily available in addition to weed were THC in the pill form.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know if that's around anymore. So THC in pill form, that was popular. Hash and hash oil was popular. And mescaline was popular, and mushrooms were popular.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I like to say that I never dabbled in psychedelics, but I did mushrooms quite a bit, so I guess that would qualify.
Yep, sure did.
There was nothing wrong with it because it was allegedly organic, but who knows what the hell was in there.
Right.
And then also at one point, somebody slipped me some PCP that I didn't know was PCP.
Yeah.
And that was pretty scary, that experience. Yeah, that was really, really, really scary. But anyway, so those are the drugs that were available while I was in high school.
Yep.
You know, I never touched anything like cocaine until I was out of school. But, you know, even when I was in college, it was primarily beer and weed and some mushrooms.
Yeah.
And, you know, that was it. But, you know, friends, neighbors, my parents' neighbors across the street, the dad who was my parents' age, I actually sold weed for him in high school. And so, I mean, I really had a lot to lose in terms of if I got caught and got suspended from school or anything like that, you know, I had a lot to lose because I really wanted to go to college. I really wanted to go into a technology field. And I knew that if I got caught doing something, so it was very rare that I did anything like that, but I did do it just occasionally to get free weed from a neighbor.
Yeah.
But mostly I bought it from my friends in school.
Did your family have an idea? I mean, your brothers or
Oh
your
yeah,
parents? Yeah.
So by the time I graduated from high school, I was smoking weed with my father.
Mhm.
We tried to grow our own, but we failed miserably. We had a ton of it, but it was weak as shit. I mean, it was not. It wasn't even. I mean, I took a big big trash bag full of it to school my freshman year to college, and just gave bags of it out to my friends. Whether they did anything with it, I have no idea. So it was nothing like any of the stuff that we got commercially. So I occasionally smoked with my father. They allowed us to drink and smoke in the house because, you know, they'd rather have us in the house
Mhm.
than out driving around and so forth.
Yeah.
And we lived in farm country. I mean, I was,
Yeah.
a city of about 40,000 when I was a kid. And, you know, we lived in the south side of town, and it was all farms and rural apple orchards and so forth, you know, trails through the woods to different neighborhoods. So you didn't have to drive anywhere to get together with your friends. I had a car in high school, which was probably a big mistake because, you know, I did get into some trouble with that. Yeah, it was tolerated in my family, and it was, you know, they let us do things in our house so that we weren't out there driving around under the influence.
Yeah, and we had a similar experience with alcohol in the house, and it wasn't. We never. I mean, and Megan mentioned this too. I mean, we never took it to any level other than we would try it. We would try a sip of Dad's beer, or we would have a glass of wine. You know, maybe before we were 21, but you know, my parents had the same philosophy. It was like, we'd rather you do it here and learn about it and learn how it affects you and all that, than to be out in public getting in trouble or, you know, going crazy.
Yeah.
So, I can relate to that.
Right. So the culture where I grew up was I mean, we're talking 1974. I know I'm dating myself here. 1974. Actually, when I was 14 and 72. So yeah, 72 is probably the first time I drank to get drunk. And but my point here is I lived in a town where gathering of friends and drinking and, you know, unloading after work, weekends, you know, I wouldn't call by today's standard, it was probably binge drinking.
Yep.
But, you know, we'd get together at parties, whoever had parents that were either out of town or were out that night, we'd have a party at their house, or we'd do it out in the woods or in the sand pit or, you know, things like that. And it was the usual thing. We've actually had our own little Woodstock where some friends of ours had built a stage out back, and they had a number of different bands come through. They ran electricity out there, and it was a hot sunny day, and we started in the morning and went into the evening with
That is
fireworks and
awesome.
everything like that. And, you know, it was a great time. We're all sitting on a hill. And just like you would think it was back in the mid 70s, it was like, you know, our own little Woodstock.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
That's so great. So how did you kind of transition out of high school years kind of into college? I mean, you knew you were
Right.
going, and like how'd you transition there?
So I applied to a number of different engineering schools, and my dream was to go to the United States Coast Guard Academy.
Oh.
And I didn't get in, even though I had, I think my senior year I had a 4.0 average, but the applications went out the summer before. I had a tough beginning of my junior year because I was really heavy into partying. So I went to WPI, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, which was my second choice. And that was an eye-opener for me. For as smart as I was in high school, I really struggled there.
Yeah.
I mean, because everybody that went to WPI was probably one of the, 10, 15, 20th brightest people in their respective high school. And I'm just saying that as kind of a matter of background, not to brag or anything.
Yeah, no, I've heard.
As smart as I thought I was ill-prepared for the course load and, the pace and the course load. We didn't have 13-week semesters. We had 7-week terms.
Yeah.
So every 7 weeks, we had another 3 classes that we took.
Man.
So crammed a semester's worth of work. So I took, Physics 101 in a 7-week period. I took Physics 102 in another 7-week period. Likewise with calculus, and I took writing and so forth. So I really struggled. It was my first time living away from home. The drinking, I was legally able to drink. And, we had a mixer. My first night there during freshman orientation, there was a keg on the floor and a tub. And, everybody was smoking weed. Our RAs smoked weed.
Yep.
And so that was kind of the thing. And I thought I was all that. And boy, did I ever get taken down a few pegs after I started getting my grades in. So I left that first term thinking that I failed calculus and physics and I passed English. And as it turns out, it was a pass-fail grading system back at WPI. So, showing up at physics was at 8 o'clock in the morning. And calculus was at 10 o'clock in the morning. So I don't know if they did that on purpose, but
I'm sure they did.
It was real tough.
Did you know what you wanted to do at the time going into college?
I wanted to get into recording. I wanted to be an audio engineer. And halfway through my junior year, sophomore year rather, when I started taking electrical engineering courses and talking to an advisor, I figured out that they didn't even offer that as a major.
Oh, gee.
So I ended up going.
Like, well, I'm here.
Field. Yeah, no, I knew I wanted to be an electrical engineer. I ended up going to systems engineering and design, and which served me really, really well in my career. So I knew what I wanted to do when I went to the school as in terms of major, but an area of specialty, they didn't offer that area of specialty. But, I did okay.
Good. That's awesome. And so how are you fending with, with drugs and alcohol at this time? So you're in college and,
Yeah, I pledged a fraternity. I pledged the same fraternity as your dad.
Yep.
And again, the drinking age was 18. So unless you were a 17-year-old freshman, the fraternities back then, I mean, we had a bar in the basement with a dance floor and a stage. So we hosted bands, and it was every weekend. And everything we did around pledging and so forth was built around keggers. We go to the football game, we'd have a keg and a wheelbarrow. We go to, homecoming, it was a keg in the back of somebody's pickup truck. Yeah. So it was, beer was very, very prevalent. It flowed. And it was just a really, really good time. And for me, the drinking was always a good time until it wasn't. So the one thing I will mention around this time frame, because I did say that I talk about kind of childhood trauma. A couple of, and I learned about this after getting clean and sober. To jump to the chase, I didn't get clean and sober until my mid-50s. So I partied like that, either publicly or secretively, for over 40 years.
Wow.
And it took its toll on my marriage. It took its toll on my health. It took its toll on my relationship with my kids. But what it didn't take its toll on, it was my advancement through my career. I ended up working at IBM for 22 years as an executive for much of that. So I was very high functioning. And that was probably a source of, I'd say, taking me away from my emotional pain by burying myself in my career.
Yep.
So like I said, I'll come back to that. But what happened in my childhood, so when I went away my freshman year in college, my brother Billy, who was 14 at the time, was diagnosed with cancer.
Mm.
And cancer back in that time frame, especially the cancer that he had, which was in his neck and throat, was a death sentence.
Ugh.
And so that was kind of one of the things that I was trying to numb myself from when I went away my freshman year, because we found out the first weekend that I went to school that he had a bad football injury, and very shortly thereafter we found out that he had cancer. I don't know
Wow.
which we would have discovered first, but the shoulder injury that he had in terms of a football injury was what led us to discover that he had cancer. So I'm going to pin that for a second, because that was a very profound experience. And then at the age of 14, I witnessed a family friend tragically killed in an accident. I was 14 at the time, and we were at a baseball game. My brother that was a year younger than me, I didn't have a game that night. His team had a game, and I was playing catch in the parking lot. And the younger brother of a family friend came running up. He was covered head to toe with mud. And he said, my brother Danny's been hurt. And so my uncle, who's a police officer, and I ran and followed him down into the woods. And there's a river down there with an old dilapidated dam. And what ended up happening, to make a long story short, is that the younger brother was up on top of the dam, and he was playing up there, and he dislodged a big chunk of concrete, and it landed on his brother down below.
Oh my
So
God.
I was the first one at the scene, because I was able to outrun my uncle, and he was still alive, and he was under this big 2-ton chunk of concrete that landed on his legs and his lap. And that image of him there is the only thing I can remember other than turning away.
Yeah.
And the next thing that I knew, it was the next morning. And the next thing I could recall was asking my father the next morning how he was doing. And he told me that he didn't make it.
Oh my God.
So
you were 14, you said?
I was 14, and my parents sent me to school.
Oh no.
Oh, I had all of this unprocessed trauma, let alone grief.
Yep. I cannot imagine that.
I was never able to recall any of that until about 8 years ago, about 6 years ago, when I went through some trauma work with a very skilled psychiatrist to draw that out and have me be able to deal with that.
Absolutely.
So
And
I had
so
two very traumatic, though that was a traumatic experience, and it was untreated trauma.
Yeah.
And I didn't know until I was in my mid-50s that was still an issue in my psychological well-being.
So in the case of that incident when you were 14, just curious, had you already started drinking then, or was that kind of before this? I'm just kind of more curious about that.
That was before. That's a great point. That was before. I didn't start drinking till we moved out of that neighborhood later on that summer.
Yeah, interesting.
Later on that summer. That fall, that September, we moved out of that neighborhood and moved to where we lived. When I ended up, it was the neighborhood that was smoking and drinking and so forth.
Wow. So absolutely, I can understand that would be, I mean, not dealing with that and just continuing on. I can see how that would affect you.
Right. And then, so like I said, when I was 18 years old, I went off to school and found out about in October that my brother had cancer. So here I am away from home for the first time. Granted, I was living close to home, but my family had each other to kind of cope with all of this. And we weren't a touchy-feely family. We didn't wear our emotions on our sleeve. We didn't really talk much about what was going on. I mean, it was 4 boys, my dad and my mom.
Yeah.
And, God love her, dealing with that, because with my brothers and me, it was more like, we were the Three Stooges and Bugs Bunny and F Troop and Gilligan's Island. And we were just meatheads when it came to behaving around my mother.
Yeah.
And, I was making my brothers cry. We were fighting all the time. We were making my mother cry. It was just terrible. But anyway, so I kind of I kind of buried myself in my schoolwork and partying as a way to cope with the fact that I had no real outlet to kind of process what was going on in my own life.
Yeah. And so you've gone through all of this, I mean, essentially, in just 18 years of life,
Right.
and you're kind of trying to figure this out. I mean, when did you know, or did you know at that time that you had a problem with drugs and alcohol, or did that come a little bit later? Like, did you kind of know underlyingly so that
Yeah.
you had an issue at 18, or?
No, because everybody else was doing it.
Yeah.
I
Right.
mean, the culture back then, again, Central Mass, your dad grew up on, the South Shore. It was the
Mhm.
same thing down there.
Yep.
I've been to Hingham. I've been to Cohasset. I know what
Yeah.
the deal is down there. It's hockey, football, Red Sox, and partying.
Yeah.
So, no, I didn't see what I was doing as a problem because everybody else was doing it. And after I figured out how to budget my time and to leave the partying for the weekends, I really buckled down that
Yeah.
second term of my freshman year. I did really well. I finally
Yeah.
figured it out.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to separate myself. In fact, everybody used to call me the rag man because I would rag on everybody over the fact that they kept wanting to make noise and party and everything, and I wanted to do my schoolwork. And so anyway, no, I didn't see it was a problem.
Mhm.
Back then, nobody really drank hard liquor, and
Yeah.
nobody was doing hard drugs.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
and you said, as far as the trauma goes, you didn't really deal with it at all. You did, like, how were you feeling? Do you remember like having unresolved issues, or did you kind of just, as you said, focus on your schoolwork and kind of just focus on school in itself and keep
I
going?
never learned how to be expressive or even to get in touch with whatever emotions and feelings I was going through. So I couldn't even articulate it because
Right.
I couldn't feel it.
Mm.
And so I put it in a box.
Yeah.
It was a box. And when I went home every other weekend or every third weekend, or if I go to Boston to bring my brother for his chemo treatments and so forth, that's when I dealt with that. And it was really, really hard to be home because
I
my
bet.
parent, I mean, try to imagine a child, your 14-year-old child going through this. And, they were blaming themselves. So I ended up being the person that my brother relied on.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for me to even talk about this now, 40 something years after the fact. I'll jump ahead to my junior year in school, which is where things really started to unravel for me. But so when I went home, I'd spend all kinds of time with my brother because, he didn't want to make my parents feel as though he was a burden,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't want to be a burden rather. And, he was still relatively healthy at that time. He didn't pass on until my senior year.
Mm-hmm.
And so he battled this thing for 3 years.
Yeah.
And through chemo and radiation, he didn't have surgery. He was able to be in remission.
Yeah.
Point where he lost a lot of weight. He was a football player. So he was about 6'1", 6'2", 220 pounds when he was playing football. He was an offensive and defensive lineman. When he was in his junior year in high school, he was able to get back in shape enough to play football.
Wow.
And believe it or not, he won his starting position back.
Wow. That's
So,
unbelievable.
yeah, and which was amazing because the whole school rallied around him. And it was an amazing thing to see. And it was a great story.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the first thing I'll say is I can only relate to you in being an older sibling and that fierce love and loyalty. So I absolutely understand, and you're saying that, you and your brother probably didn't want your parents to feel that burden. I can relate to that a lot in what we went through with Chris. Like,
Yeah.
I felt that burden is not the right word. I felt that responsibility, and I wanted to be that person that could at least lift some weight off. Right. And so that
Right.
was the approach I took. And as an oldest sibling, I can absolutely relate to that.
Yeah.
So,
And that's exactly what I did in my junior year. So sophomore year, more of the same, blah, blah, blah.
mhm.
Except I gave up baseball. I played baseball at WPI my freshman and part of my sophomore year. And then I just here's where I started to settle
Mhm.
to make room for my fraternity life. So I ended up playing on softball, volleyball, and flag football intramural teams.
Yep.
And because there was always a keg nearby. So, you know, right?
Yeah, it's set up nicely, right?
Yeah. So junior year, everything was going great. My brother was playing football. He got another injury in football, and he broke his collarbone.
Ugh.
And through the course of that, they found that his cancer came back.
Oh my God.
And the way I found out about that, I was living in an apartment off campus my junior year rather. There was a knock on the door one night. I was getting ready to go to the fraternity because we had our house meetings on Wednesday nights, and my dad was at the door with one of his neighbors. Ironically, the guy I used to sell weed for.
Oh, geez.
So, they came in, and I could see that my father was upset. And my father's friend Tom, he asked the guys that I was there with, can you give us a few minutes here? And so they left me, and I was with my father and Tom, and my father told me my brother's cancer was back. It looked really bad. We were just starting our fourth term of the year, so it would have been the end of March. It was right after spring break. So as it turns out, I went home that weekend and saw my brother and so forth. So he said, I'm going to battle this thing. I'm going to go back after it. And so I went back to school, and I couldn't focus. And so I made a decision at that time because I learned that this was probably going to be a difficult stretch.
Yeah.
They didn't say that he wasn't, it was terminal, but I made the decision that I was going to take that next term off and spend as much time with him as possible, thinking the worst.
Absolutely.
So I took that last term off, and I went home, and he was going in for chemo. And he was getting really sick. I mean, he was losing weight. I mean, he was a waif by the middle of the summer. He's down to about, he lost over 60 pounds, and he had no hair. He was white. He was addicted to Demerol. I used to give him his shots, and ironically, I never partook in it myself. But about the middle of summer, he comes to me and he says, "Listen, I want to tell you, I didn't want to tell mom and dad, but I want to end my treatment. I just don't want this way anymore." And so he put that on me, and I took it. I felt really proud of the fact that he and I had a relationship where, he could tell me that. So I ended up having to tell my family that, he was basically accepting the realities of his situation, which was extraordinarily courageous for an 18-year-old. Yeah, he was 18 at the time to make that call. I mean, he had a girlfriend. They went to the prom. He went to his graduation. I wheeled him to get his diploma in his wheelchair because he couldn't walk anymore. So that was really tough.
Yeah.
So, but I decided to go back to school in September. He was still with us when I went back to school. So this was probably 3 days after the first term started. And I went home that weekend. It was Labor Day weekend. And I was studying at the Leominster Public Library. And this is one of these moments that still gives me the chills. But I went up to the librarian and let her know who I was and was there any phone messages for me. Out of the blue, I just walked over. She said, "Yeah, your Uncle Fran called and said that you ought to get up to the hospital right away." Because my brother was in the hospital that weekend. So I got my stuff and I went up to the hospital. They lasted till about 10 minutes after I got there.
Oh my gosh.
And, which is amazing. We were all there, so we got a chance to be with him. But, that was
held
that.
out for you.
Yeah. So, that was really, really tough. But, I don't want to spend, too much time on that, other than the fact that, again, that was unresolved trauma.
Yes. Yes.
So what I did was I was there for the wake, the services. I was there for the funeral. I was playing on a softball team, and the championship was that weekend, and I couldn't play the semi-finals, but they won, and they were in the finals, and I couldn't play because we buried my brother that day.
Yeah.
And so we had a gathering at the house, and I decided, Mom and Dad, this is after everybody left. I really would like to go down the field and play this game. And so I went down to the softball field, and we had to win 2 games to win the championship, and we won them both and so forth. And, I was playing out of my mind. And
what a roller coaster of emotions and just things. Yeah. Oh my
So
God.
I had to focus on something other than dealing with my feelings. That was why I did the softball. And I went back to school the next day.
Wow.
My family were there for each other. I don't know what they did to cope. I went back to school. I went back to my schoolwork. I went back to my partying with the fraternity. I went back to my friends because that was the only place where I could express myself to other guys to process all this. And it was a huge mistake. It was a huge mistake. I white knuckled through it.
Yeah.
And, I ended up graduating.
Yep.
And the night before commencement was my first real signpost. We were downtown Worcester with some of the fraternity guys, and we all got arrested. We all got thrown in jail. We got out of jail. We basically were able to get our hearing that morning before commencement.
Yep.
And we were able to get out of jail in time to go right from jail to commencement. No shower,
my
no
goodness.
sleep, no change of clothes.
What did you get arrested for? I'm curious. If you can say.
So basically, we were all in the back of my roommate's pickup truck, and we were at a traffic light after the bars emptied out into the street in downtown Worcester. And one of the guys threw out a roll of firecrackers. And there was a police car at the corner where we were at a red light.
Oh,
so that got their attention. And so we were absolutely hammered.
Yeah.
They got us out of the pickup truck, and one of my fraternity brothers didn't have his driver's license. He had a duplicate license, and the cops were roughing him up over that. And roughing him up physically.
Right.
And so I intervened, and I got a club across the face. I had a huge cut in my face at my graduation pictures. And so 7 of us got thrown in jail for disorderly conduct.
Man, Mark, you've been through it. You've been through it, and you're
that's nothing. Right? So, and I said to my dad beforehand, before the commencement, I says, listen, Dad, I told him what happened, and I said I would have done it again. If somebody's going to, beat up one of my friends over having a legally acceptable, duplicate license, I'm going to step in for him. And he said he was proud of me. So, that was kind of a thing. But, I didn't always get into trouble when I drank, but anytime I did get into trouble, it was because I was drinking.
Right. And so when you talk about signposts, tell listeners what that means.
So a signpost in AA parlance is a warning sign along the way that should have, kind of been an early indicator that, your life is not going in the right direction, and maybe you ought to take a look at, your behavior.
Yeah.
So we choose to ignore signposts until we hit whatever bottom we hit.
Yep.
And so, the issue that night that we got arrested, it wasn't so much that I was falling down drunk, because I wasn't, but I was belligerent.
Yep.
I was arrogant. I was cocky. I was mouthy, and I paid the consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. So just quickly going back to, I'm just thinking through all of the weight that you had on you through all of this. I'm trying to put myself in your shoes of all the weight that you had on you. And, I mentioned before, what I can absolutely relate to is the sibling thing, but in addition to, the trauma that you had when you were younger, and your brother not only passing, but you having that sibling mentality of carrying, that burden. That's another part of the trauma, right? It's not just the fact that he was sick and then eventually passed. It was that you're also putting this weight on you that you're not then dealing with. And I will say personally, for me, later on, like now in my life, my feelings from back when I was so strong in dealing with Chris's situation for the family, that's just how I'm wired. It's not like that was a burden that they put on me. I chose that. That's the type of person I am. But it's amazing that it's coming up now for me to deal with that, because I've always been strong enough to just get through it.
Yeah.
And now I'm thinking back on that. So I'm just kind of channeling that. And then also thinking of all of the other things you went through, and you went through a lot. Well,
what it taught me was that, I could put things in a box and pretend they're not there. I am extraordinarily skilled at 2 things. I've got 8 years of very strong recovery under my belt. But in hindsight, I was very good at lying.
Yep.
I would lie when I would benefit from the truth. Think about that for a second. And I was very good at compartmentalizing things and putting me in a box, turning the key, and hiding the key.
And that started early.
My recovery is that your body remembers what your mind forgets. Your body will remember that trauma. May not come out for decades, but your body will remember. And that's essentially, if I had to put into a nutshell, all the years that I just went through with you, what came out of that was I used alcohol and drugs for the effect, and for the ability to keep all of my emotional pain in a box.
Right. Right. And then you've graduated, your brother has passed. Where do you go from here? Like where
I
you've
move
been
in with your
arrested.
I move in with your dad.
You moved in with my dad. Oh man. Now it's all
Yeah,
big
on
Tim's fault.
my first job out of school, I mean back in at that time frame, we're talking 1980.
Mm-hmm.
Over $20,000 a year, which was twice as much as my father was making.
Yep.
And that was to have that kind of money.
Yep.
And to be single and to have a company car and to be living just outside of Boston in my own place. And I had a field sales and marketing job, so I was traveling.
Yeah.
And so I was 22 years old, and all of my addictions and all my emotional pain came with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I moved in with Big Tim.
Big Tim, what a guy.
The
How did you
Big
guys
Tim years, living in Newton, Massachusetts, about 5 miles west of Boston.
I love it. How did you guys how did you know each other?
So I sought Tim out. He still would hang around school.
Mm-hmm.
He would come around school. He took some time off.
Yep.
So he came back to school, and he'd hang around the fraternity house and so forth. He was very active in working with the kids that were coming in that would have been a year behind him.
Yep.
And I said, listen, I got a job in Boston. And I knew that he was working in Lexington, I think, at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was working in Lexington. And so I figured, hey, let's try to find a place in 128, because he had a roommate that he didn't like. And so, we gave it a go. And,
I love it.
We had a 2-bedroom apartment on the Waltham Newton line. And we had some other WPI friends that were living downstairs.
Yep.
Candy and Kathy.
Yep.
So the 4 of us and our extended friends. And Candy, by the way, you probably know this, is how Tim met your mom.
Yes, I love that story so very much.
Right. So I met your mom. I met your mom before your dad started dating her.
How crazy is that?
Yeah. So we used to have parties, in the apartments. So that, that's when I started drinking, some hard stuff like vodka. But that's when I discovered cocaine. I discovered cocaine during those years. There was a guy across the hall who was dealing.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine from work also had access to it. And I spent a disproportional amount of my early income on that habit. And what that did for me was it allowed me to drink more because I could stay up later. So that was quite an eye opener at that time.
And did that became a habit for a while, I assume?
It did until I finally figured out that I wasn't going to be able to pay my bills.
Yeah, no kidding.
So I never let it get to that point where, I was in financial trouble, but I was aware enough about how that could easily, the only thing that you want to do when you do cocaine is more cocaine.
Yeah.
I mean, when you drink, you'll get to a point where, I've had enough.
Yep.
Like I said, I wasn't really a blackout drinker. I did it on maybe 2 or 3 times in my life. Cocaine just makes you want to do more cocaine.
Yeah.
There was no amount of alcohol and no amount of cocaine in the world that would satiate me.
Yeah. Wow. And so you found it around that time, cocaine became a thing in your life.
Right. And the alcohol really took off because I could keep it under control when it was just beer and I was in school because I had no money.
Yep.
The gating factor in me not, going out and getting wasted every night is I didn't have the money.
Right.
I barely had enough to make ends meet. So I quickly learned that I had a physical craving for alcohol and drugs.
That was around this time. So that's
when it started. And it wasn't so much that I was viewing myself as an alcoholic, is that there wasn't enough beer in that keg for me. There wasn't enough vodka in that bottle for me. And there wasn't enough cocaine in that vial for me.
Was there a moment that you realized that, or was it kind of just seeding, in your thoughts at that point? Like, is there a moment that you can remember?
Well, So I went on a couple of business trips early on in my career where I missed the appointment with a client the next morning, or I came in late because I partied so hard the night before.
Yeah.
And, so that was becoming, it wasn't frequent, but I can remember a couple of times where that happened, or
Yeah.
going into service a customer very hungover.
Hmm.
So, between that time, your dad and I only lived together for a year. I moved in with 4 other guys out in Framingham, Massachusetts after that. And that was basically, fraternity life part 2. 2 out of the 3 guys were also Fijis and from different schools. And we didn't know it until we met.
Oh my gosh. It's
From
like
Georgia,
fate.
and one was from Penn State, and then we had another roommate and another couple of roommates. But anyway, we were meatheads. We had a 10-room house. We had a weight room. We had an empty fridge in the kitchen. We had a flop house for a living room, and each one of us had our own bedroom.
Oh my God.
And it was in a residential neighborhood that was very reminiscent of the Cleavers and Leave It to Beaver.
Oh man, you guys were a disturbance.
Well, we invited all the neighbors to all of our parties, and they all came.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
It was crazy. It was
wow.
Crazy. That was kind of the period up until I met my wife.
Okay, I was going to ask you when you met her.
I was working in Boston. I was single. I was very much into the Boston punk music scene.
Mm-hmm.
I met my wife at the place where I was working. I met Vivian.
Yay, that's awesome.
So that was in April of 1983, and we've been together since.
Wow.
I only knew her for 6 months before I asked her to marry me.
I love it. You just knew, right?
6 months.
That's so cool. I love it. And hey, she said yes, right?
Well, we had the same taste in music. We loved Boston. She was a punk like I was.
Yep.
Our first date was at a club in Boston called Spit.
Yep.
And, she was decked out in leather with a short, punky haircut. I wore camo. I had long hair. Yeah.
I was going to ask you if you had anywhere near the afro or Fu Manchu that Big Tim did around those times.
No. I had straight hair. I looked like Tony Danza or John Travolta back then.
I love it. We're going to need a picture of all this.
Well, my wife and I have a picture from the photo booth at this club Spit from that night. And we went back 30 years later and did the same.
I love that. You're going to
went back 20 years later and did the same.
That's incredible. I love that.
Yeah.
Yay. So you guys have been together. Tell me about your relationship and just kind of, this effect of drugs and alcohol in that as well,
So she hated drugs. So she asked me to stop smoking weed before we got married while we were still dating. And I did. I stopped smoking weed in 1983 and never picked up weed again until probably 30 years later.
Wow.
About 28, 29 years later.
Is that because you had other things to fill that void with?
Alcohol. And so remember I told you whenever I drank, I didn't always get into trouble, but whenever I got into trouble, it was always alcohol.
Yep.
So I quit drinking cold turkey as a result of just very immature behavior and embarrassing her and myself. I said, okay, I have a problem.
Yeah.
Actually, before that, so I told you about, I had a couple of blackouts.
Mm-hmm.
I blacked out at a bachelor party for one of my fraternity brothers, where we went to a Red Sox game in Boston and went out afterwards and so forth. I drove home from Boston and I blacked out and I totaled my company car on Route 9 in Worcester. In fact, I should have killed the guy I hit.
Oh my God.
I was very, very fortunate. I destroyed the car. I had a seatbelt. He was stopped at a red light. I just plowed into him. The guy behind me said I never touched my brakes. And I don't recall getting in my car in Boston. I broke my ribs in a diagonal across my chest where my seatbelt was. That's how hard I hit him. And I pushed the rear bumper of his passenger side into the dashboard.
Yeah.
And so the driver's side was not touched. He was sitting on the driver's side. He had no passengers. And so that was signpost number 2.
Yes.
So I ended up getting arrested for driving to endanger.
Mm-hmm.
I had a car full of empties, and they did not write me up for a DWI.
Really?
Yeah. I had an uncle, the uncle who I told you about, who was with me the night that our friend died. He was a retired police officer, and he intervened on my behalf. He's
Wow.
my father, and he got the DWI taken off, and I got the driving to endanger, which meant I had to go to school to keep my license, but I didn't lose my license.
Wow.
So that should have been signpost number 2.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
anyway, signpost number 3 was that event where I embarrassed myself and my wife. I quit drinking. I went 8 years without picking up a drink. And
Really?
I was stark raving mad.
Ugh.
I was crazy. I was batshit crazy because I didn't develop the tools that you learn through your work with your brother,
Yep.
how to live life sober. I didn't have a
Right.
program. I didn't go to meetings. I just said, I don't want to drink anymore.
And you're not doing, at this point, you're not drinking and you're not smoking weed. You're not doing
I'm not doing any drugs whatsoever.
Wow. How did you do that?
Willpower.
Wow.
But I was not sober.
Right.
I didn't deal with the underlying factors, the trauma, the pain. I had what was becoming evident, an untreated mental illness in addition to the trauma around anxiety.
Right.
And which got worse and worse and worse as I got further into my career. And at the time, I wasn't diagnosed, but later on, I was also diagnosed. I am diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So I'm what you call, co-occurring, a dual diagnosis, mental
Yep.
illness and substance use disorder.
Absolutely. So important too
So
yeah.
at the end of that, so my wife and I were getting along great. We moved to New Hampshire and so forth. I want to say that we went on a trip to New York. I thought that I could drink again in safety,
Mm-hmm.
Based upon the fact that I wasn't drinking. So with her knowledge and I wouldn't say her approval, I just kind of dumped it on her.
Mm-hmm.
I started drinking again, and lo and behold, that was okay for a few years. But what I wasn't doing was being completely honest in terms of how much I was drinking and how frequently I was drinking.
Sure.
So I was sneaking.
Yep.
So there was another signpost where I embarrassed her once again. Embarrassed myself and her once again with my behavior while drinking, because like I said, I wouldn't stop.
Right.
As soon as I started a beer, there's a saying, I don't know if Chris and your family have heard it, that, one is too many and 100 aren't enough.
Yep.
That's my case. I
Yeah.
have an obsession. I'm thinking about the next one before I finish the first one.
And so when you took that first drink after 8 years, I mean, did your body just kind of like say, thank you, like we're back? I mean, you had to have felt that immediately. Yes.
Oh, it was awesome.
Right.
That effect was back. It was awesome.
And
I
then
was
you were back
reunited
to
with an old friend.
you, right? Or the
Yep.
quote you that you thought you were, right?
Right.
So,
so alcohol, like I said, got me into a little bit of trouble. And I made the choice to quit. So that second time that I had that embarrassing situation, one was at a concert and one was at a wedding. And so anyway, I embarrassed myself in front of other people, and I embarrassed her in front of other people. And, I hated the thought of hurting her. And I said, okay, I don't need this. I'll go without again. So again, I white knuckled it for a year.
oh my gosh.
Again, no program. No program.
But did you recognize at this point that you had a problem that was enough to be involved in the program?
Oh yeah. I was very self-aware in that,
Okay.
I had the energy.
Man. And then when, and if I'm jumping ahead, stop me, but then when do kids come into the mix here too?
Yeah. So kids come into the mix. Our kids are adopted from Korea. My son Joey is 26 and my daughter Selena is 24.
Amazing. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's
We
so
adopted
cool.
2 kids from Korea. I've done full amends and disclosures to both of them. So my life with them is a completely open book.
Great.
And much like your family, which is a gift.
Yep.
So we got kids somewhere after I went back out after the 1 year of being clean and sober. Now, during this time frame, I started having surgeries.
I see where this is going.
Yep. And during this time, I was my mom passed away in 1991, and that's when my mental health really started to go south. She passed away from lung cancer. It's funny because, the impact of her passing was nowhere, sad as it was nowhere near the impact of losing my brother. Of course I was much older at the time, and I had, I was an adult. So anyway, so I had major depression. I had anxiety. I couldn't sleep. I had insomnia. So I was being medicated, at the time, Effexor, which was the only thing I can remember about Effexor was that when I stopped taking it, it felt like I was tripping.
Ugh.
You get head trailing
Oh my
and
God.
so forth. I was taking Xanax for anxiety, and I was taking Ambien for sleep because I was enter into the picture. I think over my life I've had 11 surgeries, with the exception of knee surgery. When we first got married, all of those took place after I was sober. From the moment I took my first Vicodin, I knew that I had arrived. I found what was missing in my life to make me supremely confident, supremely elated, but pathetically and hopelessly addicted.
Yeah.
And so I went from Vicodins, I graduated to Percocets, and then OxyContin. My dad at the time, and I'm talking about a period of probably about 10 years that I had these surgeries. I mean, I've had both elbows, I've had both knees, one knee multiple times, broken nose, back. I broke my elbow and tore my tricep. I've had an appendectomy that went terribly wrong, that I was septic. I've had 3 hernias.
Wow.
I was delighted to have surgery because that meant that I was going to be able to score. And all of these injuries were real.
Yep.
I was elated
Yeah.
to be able to find my drug of choice.
Yeah. Incredible. And then how long did you use? I mean, how long did that go on?
Probably for the better part of 12 years. When I couldn't score through my own, I was on a pain management program I had scar tissue from one of my abdominal surgeries that was causing a burning sensation. It felt like somebody was touching my lower abdomen with a match.
Ugh.
And it was constant, always on. And so I was in a pain management program where I was prescribed 30 days worth of Perc 30s. And I graduated to higher level of dosage. And I went in and peed in a cup and got another prescription 30 days later. And that was a constant in my life. I was a junkie. And at the time I was working full time at IBM as an executive.
Yep.
And I became so dependent that, my day was comprised of 4-hour or 6-hour increments. When I would kind of come off of that dose and jet up again for my next dose.
Wow. But you said, I mean, you were functioning and you did great, right? It was working for you.
Well, the problem was that, so I eventually had a neurostimulator installed in my back to deal with that pain because I knew that I was going to die.
Yeah.
If I couldn't come off the pain meds. I did not do heroin because I had access to pills. And that's the only reason.
Right.
I had access to pills and I had a great insurance program.
Right.
And I had doctors that were willing to prescribe them. And when I ran out of them, I would just go up to Maine and visit my dad, who was being treated for chronic pain, who had 90 days worth at a time.
Yeah.
And at one time, he was prescribed OxyContin. So I was getting the best of the best. And he wasn't taking them all the time. So he never missed them. And I made amends with him before he passed on because that was a real shitty thing to do.
Right. And you mentioned heroin too, and just for those listening, heroin tends to be cheaper, correct, to receive?
And more readily available.
Right. So that's why people tend to get to heroin, and it sounds like
they graduate from pills to heroin. I didn't need to do that.
Yeah, right.
I would have. And I've told my wife that, and I've told my kids that. If I didn't have access to pills, there's no question in my mind. No question in my mind.
Where did it kind of come to a head for you?
Ooh, good question. So here's the other signpost. Between the years of 2010 and 2012, I was a hideously sick individual.
Yep.
From the outside looking in, I had it all.
Mm-hmm.
The big house, the wife, the 2 cars, the golden retriever, great neighborhood, executive at IBM, but I was bloated. I had pancreatitis. Pancreatitis, for those who may not know, is a debilitation of the inflammation of the pancreas that can turn into cancer. It's fatal. And I was in denial that I had it, even though that I was being tested to see if I did have it, and that was the working assumption. I was missing months of work at a time due to illnesses, and I was doing things that I never thought that I would bring myself to do. I was stealing, padding my expense account. On any given day, I was taking Percocets, Xanax. I was smoking weed again. I was drinking, and I was going to bed with Ambien.
Wow.
And the fact that I did not overdose in my sleep is something that I'll never figure out. Because my wife, Vivian, would say there were nights when I wasn't breathing. As a result of that, it was a miracle that, I didn't pass from that.
Absolutely.
So that came to a head in August of 2012, and I was doing all of this in a secret life.
Yeah.
So I was presenting myself as a father, as a husband, as a worker, as a community leader, a coach, youth sports, and so forth. Leading a double life.
Yep.
I was sneaking the pills. I was sneaking to the local bars. I had alcohol in the basement. I had weed out in the shed. And then prescribed drugs that, when I was getting those prescribed, I wasn't being honest with my doctors. I came to the point where, because of the discovery and the shame that came with that, I had my first plan to take my life, first of 2. And I had it all planned out. Fortunately, at that point, it was only ideation. And so I went to see my doctor, and they checked me into a psychiatric unit in Portsmouth Hospital, where I spent 5 days in a Johnny trying to get my medication, my situation stabilized. Yeah. And they were just going to send me off to 12-step. It was, and at the time, there was very little in the state of New Hampshire and in New England in terms of inpatient treatment.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going to Michael's house out in Palm Springs, which is specializes in dual diagnosis. And I did 28 days of inpatient. I took a 6-month paid leave of absence from IBM.
Yep.
And I took another 6-month partially paid leave of absence from IBM. I went down swinging. I drank every bottle of Jack Daniels on that flight, knowing that I wasn't going to drink anymore. So I went out there for 28 days inpatient. I did 28 days IOP, or intensive outpatient, living in a sober living home. I came home, and the only condition under which I was allowed back in the house was to continue with that another 28-day IOP program, which I did.
Yep.
And I did more than 90 meetings in 90 days, and I got a sponsor, and I did what people said I should do.
Yeah.
And what brought me to my knees was the letters that I opened from my kids and my wife when I got out to Palm Springs in the dorm. So I knew that if I wanted to be a part of their life, that I needed to surrender to whatever other people told me, and to develop some sense of commitment to a program.
Unbelievable. And the letters, we had similar stories with letters for Chris, and it's so personal, and I could see that would hit you hard. And have you been sober since that moment?
Yes, I have.
Congratulations.
I have. So yeah, I've been sober since. However, I had some difficulties with my mental illness in 2016, 4 years ago. I actually planned to take my life. I was actually on my way. I'd just gone through, I won't go through the gory details, but I was planning to drive my truck into a bridge on the interstate.
Oh my God.
And I got a phone call from my son while I was in the process of doing that. And he talked me off the ledge, and I drove past that bridge and up to the hospital in Portsmouth and checked myself in again.
And I assume that's where we dealt with the unresolved issues, correct?
Yes, that's where I started
Amazing.
dealing with childhood trauma.
Yeah. What did you get out of then finally dealing with that? Like, I assume it's another whole weight that's lifted off?
Yeah, it really is. I'd say, well, first of all, my depression and anxiety were formally diagnosed. And whereas before, it was just generally thought that I was dealing with depression. So
Yeah.
I finally got the DSM diagnosis codes for the mental illnesses that I was dealing with. I would have panic attacks, the anxiety, and I knew I was going to have to make some life changes. So I changed my career. That's when I got into the recovery business. I took early retirement from IBM. No, I was never going to travel on business again. I can't sleep in a hotel. I can't be left to my own devices on the road. It's just, it's too stressful. It's too dangerous. So I got non-narcotic medication for both of those, and that's under control. And to this day, I still see a therapist once a week.
Yeah.
So I'm committed to doing the work to really get to the underlying issues that lead to my mental illness and my substance use.
That's great.
But the trauma in particular, wow. So I went through what they call EMDR. And basically, it's a process by which you're taken back to the scene of the traumatic event.
Okay.
And getting to the underlying issues that you haven't resolved. So for me, with my brothers, with the boy who was killed by that falling chunk of concrete, I felt I was dealing with a lot of guilt that I could not have done more. I was 14 years old, for crying out loud. It took 8 firefighters to roll that thing off of him. And, and so, like I said, I was able to kind of recall bits and pieces of what was going on then. But basically, I was able to forgive myself for that, the guilt that I had laid upon myself as a result of not being able to do more to save this kid's life in the moment, and to be able to pull all that negative, toxic thinking out of that box that was tucked away.
Yeah.
With my brother, it was a combination of a couple of things. I couldn't forgive myself for not doing more. Even though I took time off from school, I was his caretaker that summer to give my parents a rest. I was the one he confided in that he was prepared to die and that he didn't want to be treated anymore. And I was the one that wheeled him up to get his diploma. And while his entire class and everybody in the bleachers gave him a standing ovation, in standing there for that, and so in the EMDR treatment that I got for him, I was able to go back to his bedside, and he told me that he appreciated everything I did. There was nothing more that he could have ever asked for me to do, and that he was okay. Basically, put the baseball bat down, dude. You did everything you could.
You really, and you have so much on you, right? It's like, it's a lot for one person to carry. Right. And I'm sure, even just his gesture of asking you to be the one, I feel like is his way of saying thank you,
Yeah. So, but the unresolved, I didn't deal with any of this in the moment because I went back to school.
Right.
But that whole 3-year period was a traumatic event.
Absolutely.
And if you think back, that from my freshman year until halfway through my junior year, he was sick for probably 2/3 of that, and in remission for the other third.
It's just unbelievable. And I just looked up EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. For anybody that's interested listening. That's really,
and what that involves is you hold these two almost like balloons that are connected to, they basically, your fingers, you get a pulsing in your ear, there's a tone, and you get a vibration in your hand simultaneous, and it goes back and forth. And as a result of that, you're able to block everything out and be guided to a place.
Wow. Like
a guided meditation with that throbbing in ear sensatory. And I've had it done a couple of times, and it was incredibly powerful. Through continued work with a therapist, we were kind of able to build on that experience and not only draw that out, but build coping mechanisms and using CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy to be able to tell myself that there is a solution here.
Yeah.
There are things that you can do to deal with this. This is not life-threatening.
Right.
Right.
How do you feel today?
I feel great today. Today being a collective today, you mean this point in my life?
Yep.
So it's interesting. You're not going to, maybe you will believe that. I still go to 5 or 6 meetings a week.
Good for you.
That's
great.
And I picked the pace up during the pandemic. First of all, I've done a lot of work in the recovery community since, but I'm always mindful of my own recovery, first and foremost.
Of course.
I've rebuilt the relationships with my wife and my kids. I've got a career going on that is amazingly fulfilling. I manage a grant, a $5 million grant that helps people who have been family members and individuals who've been affected by the opioid crisis. I help get them back into the workforce through finding them a job or getting them back into school at no cost to them.
Yep.
And I've been doing that for almost 2 years, and we've put over 210 people back into the workforce. So I'm doing that. I established, with the help of my wife and another person, a community recovery center here in Portsmouth, Safe Harbor Recovery Center. It's right next door from where I am right now, and that's up and running.
Great.
But my own recovery, I thrive on solitude, but I have to walk a very fine line between solitude and isolation.
Sure.
My higher power are the universal laws of nature. I marvel at things like the concept of gravity, the concept of time, being out in the woods and hearing the wind blow and not being able to see it. Birds, wildlife. I'm a photographer. In my recovery, the colors are much brighter, the air is so much sweeter, and the sounds are so much more vibrant and vital to me as a result of being able to be mindful in the moment. So my road to recovery is built on mindfulness and my spiritual condition. I'm not a religious person, but I'm a very spiritual person. But COVID. So for me, the very first week, it was like the second week in March where everything in New Hampshire shut down. And I knew I was going to be working at home for an extended period of time. And I knew that I was going to be isolated if I was not careful. We weren't doing radio back then, so I wasn't able to come to the radio station. So I made a conscious decision to stay to the same routine and ritual that I did as if COVID didn't exist. So what that meant was I started doing these Zoom meetings. I do one every day at 7 a.m.
Yep.
I take Sunday off. I give myself a break on Sunday. I still see a therapist. I still, I shower at the same time. I maintain some level of hygiene, although I haven't had a haircut in about 4 months.
Get back to that college due.
Hey, I don't flop on a couch anymore, though. But, I take my dog for a walk. I have a lunch at my regular time. I walk the dog. I exercise as best I can, and I go to my meetings. So I have the same routine as if I was not homebound.
Yeah.
And doing that 3 months later, and I know people that are really, really, really struggling, and I'm grateful that I made that decision to do that way back when. I still listen to what people tell me to do that have been in the program longer than I have. We've got this podcast series that you and I have been collaborating on. And I end my day with a daily inventory as well. And not just the bad things or the things that I could do better, but also the things that I did well. Because it's a learning experience. My goal is to be better today than I was yesterday.
I love that.
I keep it really, really, really simple.
Right. And I think that, I'm learning that also in my life is just channeling and reflecting and really paying attention to, what you've gone through in a day and how you could be better, and self-awareness and all of those things are so, so important. Talk a little bit about, I know it's funny when we decided, so Chris and I started recording about a year ago. It was a slow roll. But when we did get to the time that we were going to release this, it was funny because like the stories kind of started to merge, and that you were saying, hey, I'm actually kind of going about something similar. So would love to just hear from you, the importance of what you're trying to do on your end as well, our collaboration, and then just to give us a little color on, I know that in New Hampshire and where you are, we've have seen it be hit pretty hard by this disease. So
Right.
a little insight there.
Yeah. So on the first point, yeah, we came together. It was strange. My wife Vivian is on Facebook. I don't do social media because I'd be watching the notifications come in all day long.
Yes, yes,
I'm also diagnosed with impulse control
yeah.
disorder,
Don't do it. Just don't
which
do it.
means that I never paid attention in school. Um, Squirrel. Um, so she came to me and said, "Hey," because she's Facebook friends with Tim. Tim's Facebook friends with her. So she stayed friends with him for some reason, and it appeared in her newsfeed that you guys were starting a podcast series. And so I said, and I was thinking about doing something similar, but what I couldn't do was I didn't know where to start. And so you guys, through me reaching out to you guys had recorded, I think, 3 episodes at the time.
Yep.
And I listened to the first one, and I says, I got to get it. I got to get involved with this because your audience and your distribution is reaching. You're reaching a target audience that we probably won't touch. And we have a very, very strong need up here for insights into how families are coping.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to kind of piggyback and ask you guys to partner to the extent that we could use your podcast to rebrand and post on our channels up here. At the same time, in parallel with that, I wanted to get our own channel off the ground here of local stories.
Yep.
And so Faded series is presented in New Hampshire as is, with a little bit of an intro and an outro, just to keep our kind of jingle and direct people to our website and so forth.
Yep.
Because we operate as a nonprofit. WSCA is a radio station. We're a nonprofit, so we rely on donations and grants and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So in parallel with that, in what we have, I recorded the second chapter of this last night, the second episode rather. We have the Thanks for Asking series and it's basically families, exclusively for families. We've got one episode that's been produced and released, and it's been had 40 downloads in the week since that we posted it.
Great.
I'm going to release the second one probably by the end of this week.
Great.
And the woman who was interviewed by me last night is very famous in New Hampshire. And actually, she's very famous, period. She's been on Dateline. She's been on 2020.
Mm-hmm.
She's been on CNN. She's been to the White House.
Wow.
Personal guest of our two U.S. senators in Washington. She's been to the State of the Union.
Yep.
And she basically she's opened a residential treatment program for prenatal, so young moms expecting, and then she has transitional living for up to 2 years for those people that graduate from that program into another one.
Wow.
Clinical, she's got online on-premise staff 24/7 to help with the pregnancy, to help with the baby, to help with the nursing and so on and so forth. And they deal with babies that have been born dependent on opiates and so forth.
Yeah.
She's a very, very powerful figure, and so we're very grateful to get her as our second interview.
That's so exciting.
So, yeah, we got those two parallel things going. So just a quick note about New Hampshire. New Hampshire, 4 years ago, we had the second highest per capita opioid overdose deaths in the country, and we were first for those that are age 17 to 21.
Wow.
And we were the second lowest in terms of state contribution into treatment and recovery programs.
Wow.
So the opposite ends of both spectrum. We've come a long way now. We've got a hub and spoke model where there are 9 entries, geographical entry ports into the treatment and recovery engine within New Hampshire across the state. We've got sober living homes. We've got drug courts. We've got all kinds of programs. We've got the grant that I manage that keep people sober by helping them find work and getting them back on their feet.
That's so great.
And so we at WSCA and me in particular wanted to have a podcast series that was able to serve the people of New Hampshire with success stories for families. There are a lot of resources out there, a lot of stories, but there's a desert. It's a desert out here for programs and awareness and success stories for peer family members who are willing to come forward and help others.
Yeah. Yeah. And what you're doing is incredible. And you've essentially, you are on a volunteer basis, but what you're doing is just so needed. And I'm so glad that we kind of came together at the same time. It was really cool. No coincidence by any means. I just think that it's it's meant to be something that's
Yeah.
discussed further. And that's what we're
Right.
trying to do. And it's really worked well that at the same time, it's kind of come to a head. So I'm really pumped about that. And where can Faded listeners find you with both your podcast series, and you happen to be a radio DJ as well? So where can we listen to you, on your weekly?
So you could find the podcast at www.wscafm.org/listen. There's a podcast link that's in there.
Great.
And you'll find us there. I'll send you that so you can post it on your website.
Perfect.
I think we're actually one of your partners that are up on the website already.
Yes, you are. Absolutely.
And then so I never grew up. My emotional development was arrested at 14.
Yep.
So I still have the emotional maturity of a 14-year-old, and I say that with pride. And my musical tastes reflect that. So I do a partner of mine who's also in recovery, we do a weekly radio show. It's a 4-hour show on Friday afternoons from 1 to 5. You can find it on our webpage that I just gave you. And it's called Pirate Friday with Scurvy Dog. My nickname is Scurvy Dog.
I love it. Where does that come from?
Because I used to do a radio show here early on in my radio career called Scurvy Dog Radio, and it's a pirate theme.
I love it.
And pirate radio. So, pirate radio is underneath the radar from the FCC, and so I kind of play off that theme, and basically nobody tells me what to play. And I basically play 4 hours or in-your-face punk, garage, hard rock, alternative country, outlaw country, rarities from my childhood. I play 6 decades of music, and it works.
So cool.
It works, and there's a lot of comedy.
Yeah.
Politically, I'm kind of on the left, but in good fun, I'm poking a lot of fun at our president.
Mm-hmm.
And I do that, like I said, in good fun. But I also poke fun at other things I don't like. So I come into the show very angry at 1 o'clock on Fridays. And I use it as a palate cleanser for the weekend. That's what we call it. It's a palate cleanser for you.
Love that. Well,
there's no commercials. There's, it's just a lot of fun.
I love it. You had me at no commercials. I'm in. Well, we'll get everybody on board to listen to you on your weekly. And last but not least, and I wish we could talk for 2 more hours, which I think we could.
Before you go.
Yeah.
And this is for your listeners that are listening right now. You better not edit this. I'm going to interview you.
Oh, I would be so nervous. Is that weird?
Your story is missing.
My story is missing. You're so right. And I
am going to interview you.
Let's do it. You name the time. Let's do it.
I'm going to interview you. You're going to be you're going to be co-branded for Faded as well as Thanks for Asking.
I would love that. I think it's great. I would love to tell my story. I would be nervous too, I don't know. I'm better at being the host, but I would absolutely love the chance to tell my story. Yep.
There'll be no surprises in what happened here. I'm an open book with my family now.
Yep.
When I did my amends, I cleared the slate, and my slate is still clean.
I love it. I'm so happy for you, for where you are in your life now. You've been through a lot. And I think it's whatever you're doing for yourself is working, it seems. And you've got a great family and a great life. I'm so glad to have met you too. I think it's so funny because when Dad first reached out, I was like, oh yeah, sure, we'll talk to him. And then I was like, this is really cool. This is something.
Or I thought you were going to say it's kind of creepy.
No,
my
not
dad's
at all.
friends.
No, I feel like you're family. You are family. And it's funny because for you to have known my dad before I knew my dad, of course, it's just
and your mom.
Cool. It's just really cool,
I mean, I knew your mom as well. She's been fraternity parties. She went to school in the same city, Worcester.
It's crazy.
There's a very good chance that she's been to fraternity parties at my fraternity house.
Oh Lord, no one was ready for that.
Yeah. She probably went to a Fiji Island party. She saw the good, the bad, and the ugly.
I've seen some pictures, but I love the stories. It just makes me smile. So
yeah.
Anything you want to leave the listeners with before we go?
We are all survivors. There is no shame asking for help. People who are struggling struggling with addiction themselves, there are paths out of this. There are solutions. There are resources. And what we're trying to do here on my end is to put a spotlight on those resources that are available for for families, because stigma is a huge barrier for family members to come forward. You know, they've got to face their friends, they've got to face their workers, they got to face their brothers and sisters and so forth. So it's not easy for family members to put themselves out there. And it's almost like it's an even more secretive society than people who are in recovery themselves. And so addiction is 100% a family disease. And I encourage family members who are listening to this to get help, talk to others, use the resources that we're putting out there for you as a result of this program.
I love it. Thank you so much for your story, which is incredible, and for your insight and all the work you're doing for across the board. It's just awesome. Let's both keep it going and let's hold each other accountable on that. And thanks for everything. This has been a blast.
Thank you, Jackie, and you have a great night.
You are awesome.
This concludes this podcast episode brought to you by your friends at WSCA 106.1 FM, Portsmouth Community Radio. For more information, please visit us at www.wscafm.org.